Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 1st of December 2015, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Brian Gerrish. With me in the studio, Mike Robinson, behind the technical desk. And we'll be joined by live video Skype link by Alex Thompson from Eastern Approaches. Well, as always, the weather. Unfortunately, I can't see out of the studio window, but the last time I looked, Plymouth was pretty sort of damp and grey. And we've got a mixed bag, snowing in Perthshire apparently, pretty wet in Manchester. Holland also very wet, so they'll have to get the pumps on, otherwise the country's going to be flooded. And what else have we got here? I think that's about it, actually. We'll leave it there. Not too good. Excuse me. Well, David Cameron is geared up for the debate in Parliament about an attack on Syria. And of course, remember, he said, I don't really want any vote unless I'm absolutely sure of winning it. So presumably the fact that he's decided to have a debate in Westminster means that David Cameron already knows the foregone conclusion. Well, time will tell, but let's remind ourselves a little bit about who did the manoeuvring in the background to get us to this disastrous state where Britain is again about to unleash military attacks on an overseas sovereign state. We'll begin with the Daily Mail reporting on our old friend Brooks Newmark. Unusual picture of Mr. Newmark there because, of course, he's got his suit on. We've seen pictures of him, unfortunately, in his birthday suit, so I think I prefer this one. And here's the headline: I know Assad and I know it's time to arm the Syrian rebels and bring him down. So there were no ifs or buts here. This was Brooks Newmark boasting that he'd been on a visit to see Assad. He'd sat and had tea with Assad and his wife, and then he was slaughtering him in the British press and saying, we need to get rid of this dictator. We, who is we? We're not sure. That could be the British government. It could be Israel, because, of course, Brooks Newmark, strong supporter of Israel. But the key factor here was to arm the Syrian rebels. So we say, who created ISIS? It's pretty obvious that there was some dirty dealing behind the scenes by the British government. But of course, Mr. Newmark also reported in the Times of Israel exactly the same headline, well, maybe a bit stronger, really. Either we need to arm the rebels or there's going to be genocide. Well, the truth of it was, of course, the rebels were armed and that resulted in the genocide. Let's remind ourselves that back in May 2011, David Cameron said his belief in Israel is unshakable. So clearly David Cameron is happy to declare that his primary belief is in Israel, not in Britain and with the British public. And let's bring in that headline again from Mr. Newmark's. While I abhor the Assad regime and its hostility towards Israel, brackets, I'm Jewish, Newmark wrote in the Daily Mail article, I have a long-standing interest in Syria and the Middle East and a firm believer in the adage, diplomacy becomes a little lazy if all you do is talk to your friends. Now remember, this is Brooks Newmark, who was then boasting to General Idris of the Free Syria Army that British bombs and missiles would soon be raining down on Assad. And of course, one of the biggest scams used was the assertion that Assad had used chemical weapons in Syria, and I believe it is the UK column only that consistently pointed out that this was completely untrue because there was no documentation worldwide which actually confirmed the use of nuclear weapons by Assad. So here was Brooks Newmark. He refused to answer the question as to whether his mission to General Idris, the Free Syrian Army on the Turkish border, was an official visit as a member of David Cameron's government. He refused to answer that question. Perhaps he was acting for Israel. Perhaps he was acting for himself. We don't know. But what we can say, of course, is that David Cameron goes into the debate tomorrow with very dirty hands for wars, deceit on the nation, lies, and ultimately treason. Could have been a bit strong there, Mike. I don't know. What's your feeling?
I don't think you're being too strong there at all. As you point out, he has decided to hold a vote tomorrow. And apparently, he says we will take the action necessary to make sure we have, in many ways, the equivalent number of questions we would often have across a 2 day debate in one day. I mean, this isn't English in a certain sense. I mean, he could have just said we're going to have double the normal number of questions, but instead he says we're going to take the necessary steps to make sure we have in many ways. How can you have in many ways extra questions? I'm not quite sure about that. So I'm not sure whether David Cameron is actually sane at this point. But nonetheless, he has, as you said, clearly decided that he has the majority in Parliament that he needs in order to push forward this vote and to win this vote, because, as you pointed out, he had made the statement that he didn't want to, quote, give ISIL a propaganda coup. That was his excuse for not holding a vote in the last couple of weeks. He's now decided to. And of course, what was the trigger? Well, I believe it was the fact that Corbyn decided to allow his MPs to have a free vote. And therefore, Cameron thought he had enough people in the bag to pull this through. Now, I have to say, watching what's going on in the Labour Party at the moment, it's an absolute disgrace, because there certainly seems to be a certain element within that lot, in the Parliamentary Party at least, that are using this as just another way to get at Corbyn. And so what are we really looking at here? We're looking at people who are prepared to use a vote on whether or not to drop bombs on another country and kill civilians, including civilians. They're using that for party political shenanigans, and that's pretty psychopathic in many ways, I would have thought. So what's the point here? Well, of course, there's going to be this vote. Now, many people say that there's no point engaging in politics. There's no point writing to your MP and giving them your opinion. There's no point voting for any of these clowns in the first place. And I'm going to say, I'm afraid that if we as individuals take this attitude, we're really cowards, I would have said, because we've got to engage with these people. They represent us. They're not here to vote based on their own consciences, because, as I've said a moment ago, I don't believe they have a conscience. So they can't vote based on their own conscience. We've got to tell them what their conscience is. And if we're not doing that, then we've only got ourselves to blame for the outcome. So this is what we're saying. Hashtag do your job. We need to tell these people to do their jobs, and their jobs are to represent our views. So we've got to tell them what our views are. And we've got to remind ourselves, he who is silent is taken to agree. So if we didn't vote for them, we didn't vote for them, that's no excuse for not at least letting them know what we think at the moment. I'm certainly going to be writing to Oliver Colville later on and telling him what I think. It's about time he stopped worrying the hedgehogs and got on with representing his constituents' views in Parliament. And that, as far as I'm concerned at least, means voting against any bombing of Syria. Any comments?
Well, from me, Mike, I think the key thing is that the last time the public stood up to be counted, of course, Cameron was completely thwarted in Parliament and couldn't get his war vote through. So the public has been shown that if they actually take the action, and that is to get in there with telephone calls and emails and tweets now to put sufficient pressure on their MPs, this vote can be turned. If the public fail to get out there and put pressure, then of course what we have is David Cameron starting another unlawful war, an attack on a nation state, using all of the public assets that we provide effectively. I think, Alex, what's your view on matters coming up in Westminster?
I can only heartily repeat what Mike has said. You really have to use your voice. You don't, in the first past the post system, get the MP that everyone wants, although you get the one that the majority of people wanted, and we mustn't scrap that system. But what you do have is an opportunity to put pressure on your MP with letter writing, and that's the key. I think that the long queues of people outside the constituency surgeries 2 years ago, each one following the last with the same refrain, I'm here to talk to you about the Syria vote. That was what made the difference, really. And of course, a postbag full of letters. And Mike's quite right that a lot of these MPs don't have consciences anymore. But just think of the parable of the unjust judge in the Gospel of Luke. Even if people have got no conscience, they will eventually weary of having a letter writing and door knocking campaign because they want a bit of peace. And we shouldn't give it to them until they voted the way that the people want them to.
Well, Alex, that sums it up very nicely. In my view, these MPs should not have a moment's rest. They should know from the moment they wake up that somebody is going to be on their doorstep or in their face in an appropriate way, putting pressure on them to do the right thing.
Sorry, just one final comment.
No, that's fine, Mike.
I
thought we'd bring this up.
Because, of course, we've got to remember that not only did the last vote stop what happened in the UK, it stopped UK military action in Syria, it also stopped the United States military action in Syria. So just as a final comment from me, he is silent, taken to agree. We've got to remember, always keep this in mind. That's really it. We've got to act.
We've got to act, and it's up to all of us to do that. Well, Alex, you've got the advantage of being in Holland, so you've got the European view as what's happening post-Paris attacks. Take us through some of the things that you've selected from the European press. We've got a closure of a mosque, I think, to start off with.
Yes, Brian, it's begun. And as you can see, the headline there is a mosque closed in the Rhone region. So that's the Lyon area, southeastern France. And my strong suspicion is that churches will be next. And you'll see why on the second slide. I'm not just being rhetorical. There's a real risk of churches being closed in France and by extension in Britain too.
Shall I just read that text out, or have you got it there? Sorry.
Now you read it out then, Brian.
Right, we've got, according to the local council's press release, this closure, of which notice was given and the order carried out with the gendarmes without incident, helps avoid the risk of radicalisation to which numerous young people were being exposed by attending it and by its conduct.
So, as you probably know, in France, mayors are very powerful. And in fact, the name of the local council in France is not the council, but the prefecture. That goes back to ancient Rome. The mayor is in fact a prefect. He's been given powers to discipline and keep in order the local population. And he has fascistical powers, really, among which are, and you'll see this on the next slide as well, the power, yes, thanks, we'll go back to that in a moment, the power to close mosques or any places of assembly or worship, whether or not there is a state of emergency. We've covered this state of emergency change to the French Constitution the last couple of weeks, but as you'll see in a moment, that's not even necessary. It was invoked in this case, and even when Le Figaro was reporting the mosque closure, it had to get this dig in because the Figaro is right there with the French state and the French secularists. It begins its article by saying that a salle de prière, a prayer room, which was dit mosquée, it was called a mosque with inverted commas around mosque. So there you are. Muslims meeting can't determine whether they've got a building called a mosque. They've got just a little 2-bit prayer room as far as the press is concerned, and they've got nothing to whinge about because if the mayor wants it closed, he will send the gendarme round. First of all, they'll send a letter saying, we have orders from the local mayor to close this premises. We'll be round with our guns shortly. Nothing to complain about. And you can have the same approach taken to any place of worship, can't you? You could have a Christian church, which the press, after it had been closed, reported as a little extremist Christian prayer meeting, which the attenders called a church, in inverted commas.
Yeah, this is very dangerous, very, very dangerous stuff. And what was in my mind while you were speaking is David Cameron talking about 10,000 British troops to be used to come in on the streets of Britain to support Britain's police. This is the militarisation of the policing system. And all we need is that sort of dictatorial response that you've got in France coming into the UK as well. What was the next stage with the letter from the mayor? We just bring that up on screen again, and if we bring in the letter, this is it. And you'd made some comment here, which is to expose parishioners to the actions of an unbalanced or fanatical person.
Yes, that's the end of a quote. Now, this is the next slide logically, but it's actually chronologically prior to the first slide. This is actually the closure of a Dominican Roman Catholic open-air mass this summer. And the news was some months ago, and I brought it in now. There you are, see, May 2015 at the top. And following the last terrorist attacks in France on the 7th and 10th of January, there was, without the declaration of a state of emergency, a decision on behalf of, by a local mayor here, to stop the regular summer open-air mass that the local Dominicans lead. And there's the letter. The official address is to the curate, Monsieur le Curé. And just like in Britain, he's done this faux personal touch by writing in handwriting, Dear Father Joseph, afterwards. But it's one of these yours ever type letters. But the nub of it is the local mayor has said, we're not going to allow you to hold your open air mass this summer. And I'll read you the full sentence that you've got the end of there. His reasoning for this is, quote, religious tensions and the events of the 7th of January 2015 have led us to take a position of, here it comes, not antagonizing the adherents of secularism in order not to expose your parishioners to the actions of an unbalanced or fanatical person. So Mr. Strawman, the nutter who's going to attack this gathering, is being invoked to prevent the Roman Catholics meeting in public. And the French phrase he uses for this adherents of secularism, these notional people who are going to be very offended by the Catholics having a mass, is les adeptes de la laïcité, the adherents of laicity, which in 1909 was, 1905 actually, was brought in France as a kind of official state religion of having no religion. And yes, thanks for putting that in the corner. If we go back to that slide there, the point is that even without the state of emergency, French mayors can cancel open-air worship. As you can see from the proof is here. It's not restricted to Muslims, nor after the Paris attacks. And prayer in public is already illegal. There was a great to-do a couple of years ago about Muslims praying on the streets because they didn't have capacity in the mosques. May have something to do with restrictive planning permission on mosques. And so they were spilling out and bowing down in the street and on squares outside the mosques. And the disgusted French state reaction was to ban prayer in public. So if I'm with a couple of friends on the banks of the Seine having lunch, and if I stop to give thanks for my food, there is a real chance that a policeman will come along and say, Monsieur, vous n'avez pas le droit.
Yeah. And for many people, of course, France is a time for holidays, relaxation, sunshine and a glass of wine. So when they're in France, they never really pick up on the type of control by the French state. It seems to me that control is already much harsher than in UK, but Cameron is trying to follow up. Is that what he was discussing in his recent chat with Mr. Hollande, I wonder?
I think it's certainly what he was discussing, and the key is local level. Any absolutist government, going back to Rome, who was the first to do this in Europe, realizes that you need to divide up the territory and have a strong man on behalf of the government in each locality who takes his orders directly, or his authority directly from the centre. And there's been a lot of people commenting recently about mayors having a role given to them which they never had before. I mean, for starters, the Mayor of London. Well, we used to have a Mayor of London, the Lord Mayor. Of course, that's a lapdog of the city now, but that is the established Mayor of London. All of a sudden, we hear about these elected mayors, just like these elected police and crime commissioners. Well, yes, there's some kind of election held for them, but then they're unsackable. And they have ultimate authority. They have the whip hand over Parliament and everything, don't they? So the Boris Johnson types, going down to local level in Britain, are going to be the ones whose power rises to their heads and who suddenly decide, having had no background in the constitution or a national job, that they want to ban a church.
Alex, this is why it's so important that we continue to demand our common law rights in this country, because what we have in France, of course, is civil law, and the basis of that is that you have the permission to do nothing unless it's expressly permitted by law, whereas we have the opposite situation where we are entitled to do anything unless a law refuses us the permission to do that, or we're infringing somebody's rights in some way. So it's a completely different type of legal system, and this pushing mayors into this country is another attempt to bring civil law over the top of common law, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And the deliberate unschooling of people in common law is the key here, because people grow up in Britain assuming that what we know as civil law is the norm, that you're not allowed to do that because the law doesn't say you're allowed to. And if you push and float that attitude in across the generations, then civil law can creep in. It's the natural assumption of despotism, that laws need to establish the legality of something, whereas in fact they only forbid things by common consent.
And we're already seeing the rise of the city-states. We use that term here in UK. So definite patterns spreading throughout the European Union. You've focused on this scene here, which I've looked at this picture several times this morning, and I just don't get a good feeling from it. It's very grey, very austere. What's actually happening?
This is the Hôtel des Invalides, which anyone who studied French history will know played a crucial role in the French Revolution and so on, with the wounded being laid out there. What we have here is the modern French cult of the state. You know that every prefecture in France has the bust of Marianne, the personification of the French state. When the French have cartoons about national mourning, they show Marianne as a young woman weeping. And this goes back to the French Enlightenment, which is a very different Enlightenment from the German or the Scots Enlightenment. It doesn't focus on real learning or wisdom. The French Enlightenment focuses on man becoming the pinnacle of his own destiny and worshipping the goddess reason, which goes back to Babylon religion, really. So the French state, certainly since 100 years ago with the official introduction of secularism, laïcité, doesn't permit any kind of mixing of worship, at least not of God, with the state. But you can worship the devil all right if you have him in the right guises, such as Marianne and secularism. Now, this is the act of mourning for the victims of the Paris attacks.
I'll just bring the text in for you here, Alex, which we can do on screen, should come up. Yep.
Yes, people who can read French and who wish to pause the screen can do so if they're watching after the live broadcast. But I'll pick out the main stuff that's going on here. This is a quote from Le Monde. So as I said before, this is the French equivalent of the Times. This is the establishment version of the official ceremony. So this is straight from the French government's mouth, as it were. The ceremony lasted nearly an hour. Its ultimate scenography, its casting, was adjusted several times. The national anthem, the Marseillaise, was played at the beginning and end of the ceremony. So there's a bit of repetitiveness already. They don't have anything else to play. And then, this is the really staggering bit, what did they sing? They can't sing, "Our God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come." Oh, no. But they can sing "Quand on n'a que l'amour" by Jacques Brel, which is, I won't attempt to sing it, although I learned the words when I was studying French some time ago. You remember that 60s crooner, Jacques Brel? It's a soppy love song, basically, and this was shown on giant screens. And then, even worse, Barbara, who's another crooner of the same vintage, she has a song called Perlimpinpin. Yes, it's as stupid as it sounds. And that was read out while they put on screen the names and ages of all those who'd been assassinated. And here's the French privacy law coming in, with the exception of one whose bereaved relatives were opposed to showing their image. And then the last sentence on screen here says that the suggestion of sounding a toll of bells for the dead was scrapped because it was considered inappropriate for civilian victims. You're getting a view here of what the French state regards as levels of sacrificial victims. And the question is, what are they being sacrificed to, and by whom and for whom? 3 bereaved families, I'm reading off the article again, publicly dissociated themselves from this commemoration in disgust at what they said was France's failure to tackle terrorism since the January attacks. And this was actually called a Republican Mass. Perhaps you can put that on screen.
I can just bring it in over the audience just to make the statement. It's a little bit faint there, but
I didn't invent that terminology. It was actually called une messe républicaine by Le Monde. So since the French Revolution, they've taken Christian terminology and applied it to their secularist celebrations. They even have, it's coming back into vogue now, civil baptism at a town hall with no Christian. They just borrow the word, you see. So this is a Republican Mass. Well, if you put any adjective before Mass, then it usually implies Satanism. Black Mass, solemn Mass, midnight Mass, or whatever. It usually implies that something is being deliberately inverted.
Well, whether or not the viewers and audience believe me today, when I was looking at the picture, first of all, that term Republican mass had not come across. You hadn't given that to us. I just picked up that the whole thing was particularly grey. So perhaps as we move towards black masses in government, this is a grey mass. And of course, we'll remember that the Royal Navy proudly boasts being, would appear, the first Navy worldwide to accept Satanism as a suitable religion for practicing on board. Well, if that's the state of religion in France at the moment, we obviously should be waving a few flags, and apparently that's good business at the moment.
This is Luc Doublet, who owns the Doublet family firm, and it's a major, or the largest, I'm not sure which, flag producer in Europe. Not surprising that the French have the largest producer of anything in Europe, because we don't seem to have the patriotism, certainly not in government, to support our industries. But Mr. Doublet, who has his studios somewhere near Lille, says that he has a bulging order book, and he's told Les Echos that this indicates, in his opinion, that the French people are, quote, moving from nationalism to patriotism as they come to terms with the Paris attacks. Well, I would say that it's quite the opposite. They're not going from jingoistic nationalism to solemn patriotism. They're being whipped up from shock and horror into gung-ho attitude, wouldn't you say?
Well, I'd say that's the case because, of course, we are not alone in asking more and more questions about what exactly did happen in the Paris attacks. We accept people died, but what was the exact circumstance of those attacks? And, of course, we're still pointing out that we have not had answers from British intelligence services as to how the British were unable to forecast the attacks when Israel, Turkey and Iraq were doing so. Well, the solution is let it happen and then wave the flags, but the impact is quite substantial. You've got something on train departures here from Antwerp Central Station.
This is yesterday morning at Antwerp Central Station, and as you can see, I took it at 11:25 local, and you might look at the top of the board and think, oh dear, all the trains to Amsterdam have been cancelled. Well, indeed, it says here, indefinite delay. To the top three, you see Amsterdam Central, 8:30, 9:30 and 10:30, still awaiting the Thalys. That's the THA, the high speed. It's a TGV variant, really, the Thalys. It goes between Paris and Amsterdam via Belgium. But look near the bottom and you see that the regular trains, including those crossing borders to France and the Netherlands, are running just fine. Now, what's going on here is that the Thalys train is supposedly on a heightened threat alert since that dodgy incident last month with the off-duty Marines, remember, who just happened to be able to hear someone clicking a pump-action shotgun together in the toilet and jump him. Do you remember that incident?
Indeed, yeah.
Yes, and so the Thalys, we're now told, with the Paris attacks having subsequently followed that, the Thalys trains are going to have ticket barriers and identity checks put in. Certainly at main stations, the Gare du Nord, which is the Paris terminus of it, and Amsterdam Central, the northern terminus of it, and Brussels Gare du Midi, which is where all the terrorists usually hop on. But you have a wealth of other stations along the route, like this one, Antwerp Central. And nearer me, you have Rotterdam Central and Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam. And in those stations, the Thalys high-speed train just trundles through an ordinary platform, and there's no way of separating those people getting on and off from the regular traffic. So, A, it's a feint, it's a bit of duplicity, and B, it will give people the idea that high-speed trains are more trouble than they're worth. And I don't know what your view, particularly Mike's view, is of HS2 in Britain and its necessity and whether it's the right idea, but I can foresee problems here, and I can see a creep whereby identity checks are introduced on our trains. Well, we have them on Eurostar already, but national trains, with the excuse that this train originated on the continent. Because before we know it, there's going to be the plan that there already was from the 90s to have through trains from, say, Glasgow to Brussels or Edinburgh to Paris. And if you hop on that between Newcastle and London King's Cross, you may have to show your passport. And once you've got inured to that, you may have to show your passport to travel on regular trains or coaches. And I think that's already happened at Birmingham Coach Station once in Digbeth a few years ago. The police just sprung an ID check on people.
Just before I invite Mike in on that, you had another shot from the station, which I'll just bring in over the top of the other one. I don't know whether there was any additional information you wanted to talk about, or that was just emphasising.
This is the end of the day, and by the end of the day, the French have started sending the Thalys trains up with an hour and, well, nearly 2 hours delay. You see at the top right there of the left-hand screen, an hour and 48 minutes delay. That's what the plus means, is a delay. But then scroll across to the 1745, which is the fifth train on the right-hand side of the board, and you see that the Amsterdam Central regular intercity is running just fine. Now, what might happen, I fear that it will happen, is that people will be told, well, you see, the terrorists have got wise to these Thalys checks, so even the regular intercity trains that cross borders are going to have to be checked.
Alex, this is a fascinating subject. I think we might come back onto this. I had the pleasure of working for TransPennine Express some years ago, and I came into contact with passengers, particularly passengers who were making complaints about their rail journeys. And one of the things which constantly came up was the behaviour of the so-called revenue collection teams. And these are usually pretty heavily built men in black coats, invariably black coats, some women as well, who are making sure people don't get on the platform unless they got a ticket. But the overwhelming complaints coming in were that people felt that they were being treated in a, at best, very brusque way, or at worst, thuggish behaviour by these so-called revenue collection people. Added to that, the arrival of CCTV inside the carriages, so you're sat there but being constantly watched. My impression, going back, whatever it was, 6 years, something like that, was that we had a very draconian system suddenly being implemented onto our railways, all apparently to do with making sure they didn't lose revenue through the relatively small number of people who would try and ride without tickets. Whether that's connected or not, I don't know, but certainly we're seeing rail travellers treated just as if they were going into an airport, or certainly in UK, that's the situation.
Talk about the shocking and heavy-handedness of passengers just out of shot there. I didn't fancy taking a shot of them because on the continent you can be arrested for these kinds of things. Just out of shot were two Belgian paras with the same threatening pose that I showed in the pictures last week, the rifle slung diagonally across the chest, but in the wrong position to fire rapidly, with the right hand on the barrel and the left on the butt. But then I went down the escalators towards the train I was going to take, and there you had two guys with grey flak jackets, black berets with a red badge on the cap, and they were holding their rifles in ready-to-fire position with the stock up to the top left. So they were the really serious guys, and the ones up the top at concourse level were there for show, I think. But interesting that the Belgians are posting them in pairs at the station. I suppose the most charitable explanation for that is that they really fear that someone is going to take pot shots at a soldier if he's on his own. Yeah,
it's certainly a police state in front of our eyes. And of course, migration of people making all of this worse. We've had the recent announcement that, of course, Turkey's earned points. As a few people have cynically said, the Turks shoot down the Russian aircraft. They're rewarded by being allowed movement within the European Schengen area. But you've picked up on some migration statistics here from Migration Watch UK. I'll just bring in the first graph that you had seen. What right. Tell us about this one.
This is the one we're supposed to take notice of. The Migration Watch data set is from the Office of National Statistics, and they've provided a very user-friendly interface to interrogate the data set, which has just been put up this week for the year ending June 2015, which is a very strange way of doing things. It's not a financial year or a calendar year, but never mind. Now, the one we're supposed to take notice of, what they call the headline figure, is this one. Rising steeply from nearly 0,000 up to nearly 200,000 is total EU net migration. Net migration, of course, is immigration minus emigration. So very roughly, we have more than 500,000 people coming into the country every year as new arrivals, but we have 300,000 mostly British citizens leaving the country, and we're told that the headline figure is net migration, which is more manageable to the public consciousness. It's less than 300,000. In fact, the EU portion of that is less than 200,000, and the other 100,000 is rest of world new arrivals from the Commonwealth and elsewhere. Now, you can see here that the sharp jerks go in two waves. First, 2004, with the addition of the enlargement of the EU to the east. And secondly, again, the last 3 years, for which we're supposed to blame the two latest arrivals to the European Union, Romania and Bulgaria. That's pretty much what we're told, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Now let's go to the second slide. This is not net migration, but immigration. Immigration alone. People coming into the country, never mind how many British people have had enough and are leaving. And you can see that the people who are blamed, the Romanians and Bulgarians, collectively known as the EU2, are the Greens. They have contributed not very much, fewer than 50,000 a year. And as you see there has been a sharp increase, but it's leveled off since last year. Then you have the EU8, which is Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, and the other four of the 2005 accession states. There's the big peak, nearly more than 100,000, almost all Poles coming in 2006, and then settling down. So they are not increasingly coming to the country. Now look at the blue, EU14. That is the pre-2005 Western European EU member states. And they have shot up, but they were contributing 50, 60, 70,000 people a year anyway for years back to the early 90s. So that was the background. It was already as many people as Eastern Europe was ever providing. And all of a sudden, 2013, 14, 15, French, Italian, Spanish workers have shot up to 150,000 almost per year. That is where the inundation is coming.
Well, of course, immigration, very emotive subject. We've started to move on to it. We've done a couple of talks which produced very interesting results. The first one was many people just too scared to speak out in public to even say what they feel about this. But we've shown this slide before. We'll bring it up again. What is creating the migration? Well, of course, we've had open border policy by the EU, helped with the Schengen Agreement. But in the background, we've got this sort of thing, the Global Forum on Migration Development. And here we've got the head, Peter Sutherland, who declared in 2012 the EU should be doing its best to encourage mass migration to undermine the homogeneity of European countries. And if we have a look into the background of this man, well, he is an internationalist extraordinaire. So UN Special Representative for Migration, Chairman of Goldman Sachs, European Roundtable, Bilderberg. Isn't this where the policy is really coming from, these people? And we're seeing the effects on the ground now, either via economic migration or refugee status from war zones. It's been created.
It has been created, and the key thing to bear in mind is that it is not the Eastern Europeans' fault. That might sound like a cliche. It's not their fault that they're coming, but my point from those statistics is it's not even them who are largely coming. It's people who have been either lured out for big salaries to the city or priced out of their own economies in Germany, France, Benelux, Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, the Irish Republic. Well, I don't have a quibble with the Irish Republic because we have a common travel and work area with them which will survive the EU, God willing. And we're certainly one people with them in consciousness. But it's certainly not the Eastern Europeans, much less Arab immigrants or whatever, who are causing this housing problem. It's the two unmentionables of immigration from other rich countries and divorce.
Okay, well, one name we are going to mention is Mr. Soros, and just have a look at part of the Soros activities here. We've got the International Migration Initiative, and if I bring a bit of the small print up top right, through empowerment, policy change and legal action, we target reforms that can meaningfully improve the working and living conditions of migrants. On it goes. In the Middle East, the Open Society Foundations focus on providing grants to organisations addressing issues of governance and rights, media information, women's empowerment, etc. So our comment is, never mind elected representation, we've got George Soros in the background telling us what we're going to do. Well, he's very big at controlling the West, but it's taken President Putin to do something different, because the Russian Foreign Ministry is now taking steps to move forward laws banning undesirable foreign groups in Russia, and that has now been targeted against Mr. Soros's organisations. So this is what's being reported by Russia Today. The bill on undesirable foreign organisations was signed into law by President Vladimir Putin in late May. The new law allows the Prosecutor General's Office and Foreign Ministry to create a prescribed list of undesirable foreign organisations. The main criteria for putting a foreign or international NGO on the list is a threat to the constitutional order and defence capability or to the security of the Russian state. So no messing around. If we have a look at this, we had a foreign agents law brought forward in 2012. All NGOs engaged in Russian politics and receiving funding from abroad have to register as foreign agents or risk fines. And then we've got the law on undesirable foreign groups, and that's going to restrict those particular groups. But George Soros, for the first time, mentioned, so do have a look yourselves. Here's Open Society. Of course, it's a wonderful thing. The foundations work to build vibrant and tolerant societies whose governments are accountable and open to the participation of all people. And if you've any doubt as to what this man's interested in, well, he spent, according to his own words, $30 billion over 30 years, changing the world into his particular mould. Here's some of the staff. Have a look at them. And if you go to this page here, you can see all the programs that have been listed. There's early childhood, there's fiscal governance, there's drug policy, human rights, migration. George Soros is into everything. And if you follow it through, and this seems to be what President Putin has bowled out, this is a lie, and what is actually happening is subversion. Well, let's have a look at the man. Here he is. The Russians clearly saying that his activities are anti-Russian, and this is why members of the Russian government have said we've got to deal with this man. These are the sorts of things they're talking about: persistent anti-Russian activities over decades, promoting hatred against Russians in Ukraine, proxy subversive operations in the Russian Federation, destruction of the Russian education system, and assisting EU financial and military aid in Ukraine. As the reports from Russia Today say, George Soros admits playing a key role in violent colour revolutions in many post-Soviet states, including the Ukraine and Georgia. Now, I can imagine, Alex, that you would have quite a bit to say on some of these. Let me just add a little bit more, and we come through. These are some of the types of thing that George Soros has been involved with. The Institute for New Economic Thinking, a mere $50 million for them. And the university they like using, which is the Central European University, a quick 206 million. He's connected with the London School of Economics. By coincidence, so is Julia Middleton from Common Purpose. Chatham House is benefiting from him. The Centre for International Governance, the Basili School of International Affairs, and one that's been reported by UK column, Igloo, which is an organisation, well, it says, imagine a single place which connects diverse minds from around the world for a common purpose, global change. So this man, very, very powerful, and many people pointing fingers saying, who is this man to be meddling not only in third world countries, but also America itself? Excellent article here from Front Page talking about the American Common Purpose Project. And if we have a look at that in a web form, here it is. This is what Obama had to say. There are some who question the scale of our ambitions, who suggest that our system cannot tolerate too many big plans, for they've forgotten what this country has already done, what free men and women can achieve when imagination is joined to common purpose and necessity to courage. Well, Common Purpose Exposed has been reporting this over many years, but of course George Soros helping to fund this. Also involved with Media Matters, the Centre for American Progress, Organising for Action, and Democracy Alliance. Alex, this man, immensely powerful because of virtue of billions of dollars. he seems to be genuinely subversive, and it seems Putin has bowled him out.
Agreed, Brian. If there's one man in the world who merits the label subversive, then it's George Soros. Born in Hungary, he makes a lot of his families having suffered in the Holocaust, and apparently we're not supposed to look too deeply into his own activities because that's what he says about his motivation. He was brought up fluent in Esperanto. Esperanto is his native language, the artificial language created by Ludwig Zamenhof in the 19th century. So his parents believed in a one-world post-national government, and he's seen attempts, incarnations of that attempt at one-world government come and go, and he's still at the old game at whatever advanced age he is. Merit in the chat room has just said you can learn a lot from studying Soros and his fellow demons. I don't think that language is too strong. I think it's very perceptive. Soros, I'll hand over to Mike in a moment to talk about Black Monday, or was it Black Wednesday, I beg your pardon, in 92. But Soros has been at this for a long time, destabilizing various countries. And he, for example, in Georgia, he placed Soros open society centers in Tbilisi for young people to be able to access the internet at a time when nobody else was offering internet access. And I saw the queues of young people eager to go into a Soros institution in order to get a view on the outside world. I believe that they were being tracked and catalogued for value as friend or foe to the future New World Order.
Okay, Alex, thank you for that. I'll just briefly drop in this. This has come out of the UK column paper where we were showing the role of what we call the hidden Fabian government, the third sector in Britain. And this is where culture change in Britain, this is the engine room of it. So 1,300 government departments, massive explosion, 170 odd thousand charities. Where's the policy really coming from? Well, top is a diagram of circles. That's the world banking cartel ultimately driving policy through, and of course George Soros in it. And how does it come into the country? Well, it has not come in as one massive change. It's been a very soft change in behaviour. This we've shown before. This is a policy document, cooperative councils, and it says at the bottom underlined, behaviour change and soft power are at the core of its aspirations for the new relationship. So in our view, this is behaviour change, and this is soft Soros-type power, which is destroying Britain. It seems that President Putin has got the guts to actually stand up and stop it. Where does it lead? Well, we think it's somewhere here. Tell us a bit about this.
Yes, before I forget, by the way, Cameron was a Treasury advisor to Norman Lamont in 1992 during Black Wednesday. Mike will correct me if I'm wrong, but it's very interesting that he got his head start in politics, trying vainly to oppose Soros's run on the pound, and now he is another one of these puppets in Soros's hands, just like Saakashvili, the ex-president of Georgia, who got every order he ever had was straight from Soros. Does Mike want to come in on that?
No, other than say you're absolutely right.
Okay, then. Let's go to Scotland. Now, normally, of course, David would be covering Scott's material. Unfortunately, he's not available to do that today. But here we have Boyd McAdam. That's the top picture, not the naked dancing satyr, but the conventional-looking civil servant at the top. Here is a screenshot from his Instagram account. Yes, senior civil servants have Instagram accounts, more suited for teenagers, perhaps, with nothing to do, but he even says on his Twitter feed that he is someone who takes a lot of photos, and doesn't it show? You can see his job title there. Would you like to read that job title out, Brian?
Public servant involved in the system supporting vulnerable children.
Brian, what do you have to say about a person of that job title who sticks photos of naked raving satanic satyrs up on his website?
Well, he's totally unsuitable for the job he's currently in.
Yes.
To me, it raises a number of very disturbing questions about this man and his values.
He would, of course, plead that he's just taking pictures of Edinburgh's cultural diversity and whatnot. Now, the point here is we must give credit here to David Scott's wife, Leslie, who has dug this up together with others. Well, there is a text that we have. I think you have a slide about it.
Bring it up under the picture. We'll just add it here.
Thank you. Now, the point here is that the acronym GERFEC is for Getting It Right for Every Child, and the full version is for every child in care and looked after, but in fact every child in Scotland, which is the catch-all term for named person and every other initiative of that kind. And the motivation behind named person is getting it right for every child. Now, David covered last week that there was such a thing as a GERFEC board. And it was a kind of sounding board for people at least half an arm's length removed from the Scottish state to think about how the named person scheme would be implemented and to raise possible problems and say, hang on a moment, are we doing things the right way? Are we going about it wisely? And you may recall David said that that board had been secretly disbanded. Recall that?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Now, here is what's been dug up by Leslie Scott and others from the November 2012 board minutes, acquired under FOI request, I'm sure, before the board was wound up. There was a suggestion, says Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous Minute Taker, that we need to do more to, quote, take the community with us. In other words, explain to the people of Scotland that they're going to have spies for their children. Families, carers and children were not, it was said by someone in the meeting, switched on to GERFEC. What a blood-curdling phrase. Boyd McAdam, that's the man in the photo here, pointed out that it had been a conscious decision to focus first on embedding getting it right for every child in the professional practice of all stakeholder delivery bodies before raising awareness in the general public. First, get the mechanism in place and then spring it on the Scottish people. Now, I have a couple of articles here which I'll read very brief extracts from, which tell us something about Boyd McAdam. The first is the Herald, Scotland's national newspaper, or as close as you get to that, from his appointment in July 2014. And he is one of the two men who are interviewed. And the first paragraph of the Herald's article, July 2014, the article titled, if you want to look it up, is "Listening Role is Vital for New Chiefs to Help Young People." Now, the Herald begins by saying, the two men responsible for Scotland's crucial children's hearing system would prefer not to be in the spotlight. You don't say. It says that the adjective troubled has come to attach itself to the children's hearing system, of which McAdam was the head, and then appointed. Then it talks about Scotland's unique child welfare system. We see that Mr. McAdam is a career civil servant with 9 years' experience, 1997 to 2006, of working directly in children's hearings. Then Mr. McAdam is quoted, and he says such things as this: the scheduling of hearings is an issue. This is if children are having to appear at hearings to defend their being in their families, for example. He says, quote, young people find it stigmatizing being taken out of school. They would prefer afternoon or evening hearings. Well, wouldn't you if you were a teenager and your friends were wondering why you weren't in class and found out it was because you were having a hearing about your family? But he says, or he concedes, the Herald says, it's problematic for professionals. Perhaps the Scottish state isn't paying his children's hearing staff enough for them to bother to turn up in the afternoon to hear children without their friends hearing about, realizing that they've been pulled out of school for it. I find that disgusting. Then we have his slide notes for a presentation. I'll keep this very brief. He says in this presentation of Getting It Right for Every Child, this is exactly the philosophy he was talking about in the board meeting, right, in 2012. Getting it right for every child is very much work in progress. We've been pushing, developing the agenda over the past 6 years, and this is a couple of years old. I think there's at least another 5+ years to go before we see this embedded in actual practice. So it's a decades-long programme before it gets to the public. We started with Highland, as in Highland Council of Scotland, looking at how professionals and systems needed to change.
And I think we might have I think unfortunately we've got to hang up there. We will, I think we will come back onto that subject, obviously extremely important. We've lost Alex, so we will come to the closure for today's news. But just to say, looking across events throughout Europe at the moment, we've got David Cameron clamouring for war. We've got massive police and military clampdowns as a result of the Paris attacks. And in Scotland, where of course we already now have a police state, a single police force married to a single political party itself embedded with the judiciary, we are now saying the state is best placed to bring up children. Serious times for Britain and Europe. What's the solution? Well, let's get enough people active to try and close down that Westminster vote tomorrow and to protect the people of Syria from yet another onslaught by David Cameron and British Conservatives. And let's follow that up by exposing what is really happening in Europe, and that is a dictatorship forming under our very noses. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow. Goodbye.